Hannington, a special force soldier, never imagined that a simple road trip with his fiancée would turn into a fight for his dignity. What began as a routine drive would test their strength, reveal hidden injustices, and end with a twist that neither of them could have predicted. Keep watching to find out how this story unfolds. Before we begin, where are you watching our videos from? Drop your location in the comment section. Let's begin. Hannington squinted into the morning sunlight, the open road stretching endlessly before him. Beside him sat Alia, her curls bouncing as she turned to laugh at something he had just said. She was always laughing at his serious soldier face, teasing him for his tendency to be a bit too cautious, even when things were meant to be fun. Today, though, he had promised himself he would let go and just enjoy. After all, this road trip had been her idea, a chance to escape the weight of duty and just be themselves before he'd be deployed again. They had spent hours planning the trip, poring over maps and plotting their route, deciding to take the scenic path instead of the quickest one. Hannington knew Alia was thrilled. She loved discovering small towns, taking pictures of quirky landmarks, and stopping at any roadside diner with a neon sign. And here he was, a tough soldier softened by her excitement, willing to follow wherever she wanted to go. As they drove, Hannington let himself unwind, listening to her chatter about the future. They talked about the places they'd visit, the tiny cafe she wanted to find that supposedly made the best pie, and the surprise stops she had planned that she was determined to keep secret. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow across the fields that stretched beside the road. Everything seemed just right. After a while, they stopped at a spot to take a few photos. Hannington, trying his best to capture the moment, ended up clicking more pictures of Alia laughing and posing than he did of the scenery. She was radiant, happy, and free, and her joy was contagious. They took selfies together, Hannington even managing to crack a rare smile as she made funny faces, pulling him close and whispering promises of many more trips, many more adventures. Back on the road, they hit a stretch of highway lined by dense trees on either side. The road was quiet, nearly deserted, which gave it a peaceful, almost magical quality. Hannington let out a contented sigh, his hand reaching over to gently squeeze Alia's as they drove. They shared a quiet, tender moment, the kind that made him grateful he had her by his side. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Hannington spotted something that set him on edge. A police car, its black and white frame unmistakable, pulled onto the road behind them. At first, he didn't think much of it, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he noticed the car wasn't passing by. Instead, it stayed in line with them, keeping a steady distance, but close enough to be noticeable. His shoulders tensed, and a chill crept up his spine. "Hey," Alia said, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "You okay?" Yeah, I'm good," he replied, though he was already on high alert. He didn't want to worry her, but the military training that had kept him alive in dangerous situations was telling him that something was off. They kept driving, but the police car didn't pass. Minutes ticked by, and it still lingered behind them. Hannington's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He had always been cautious, some might say a little too cautious, but there was something about this that made him uneasy in a way he couldn't shake. He didn't want to spoil the trip, but his instincts had rarely led him wrong. Maybe it's nothing, he thought, trying to silence the nagging voice in his head. Just a cop on patrol. But his gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror, where the police car remained, shadowing them at every turn. "Hey, what's with the frown?" Alia asked playfully, nudging him. "Come on, we're on an adventure." Hannington forced a smile, not wanting to worry her. "Nothing, just noticing something," he said vaguely. She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Noticing what?" "Oh, just the view," he replied, glancing out at the fields that stretched beyond the road, though his attention was still on the car following them. She looked back, her eyes lighting up as if she had spotted the most beautiful landscape. "Yeah, "It's gorgeous out here, isn't it?" she said, squeezing his hand. She seemed oblivious to the police car, and Hannington was grateful for it. He didn't want to alarm her. Not yet, anyway. But deep down, his unease grew. Alia was the one person he'd die to protect, and the idea of something ruining this moment with her, of anyone or anything putting her in harm's way, stirred a feeling of defensiveness that lay dormant in his chest. He shook it off, convincing himself he was just being overly sensitive. They stopped at another small-town diner, one that Alia insisted on visiting because it looked like something straight out of a 1950s movie. They grabbed coffee and shared a slice of pie, while Alia excitedly snapped pictures of the decor, giggling and urging Hannington to try her cherry pie. But as they left the diner and got back into the car, Hannington's heart sank when he saw the police car parked across the street, still in view. His pulse quickened. "This isn't just a coincidence," he thought. "They're following us." They continued down the road. As they neared the next town, Hannington felt the tension reach a breaking point. The police car was still there, unwavering, like a shadow they couldn't shake. It pulled closer as if taunting them, and Hannington's instincts screamed at him to stay calm, to not let his emotions get the best of him. Alia noticed his silence, her smile fading. "Hannington, what's going on?" He hesitated, not wanting to shatter the carefree day she'd imagined, but he knew he couldn't hide the truth any longer. Taking a deep breath, he turned to her. "There's a police car that's been following us for a while," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know why, but something doesn't feel right." Alia's eyes widened, her own excitement dimming as she processed his words. She glanced back, finally noticing the police car lingering close behind. She looked at Hannington, her face now mirroring the worry in his. "What should we do?" she whispered. He reached over, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry," he said softly, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We'll just keep driving. It's probably nothing." The police car ordered them to stop. Hannington pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to steady his breathing. Alia looked at him, her wide eyes full of worry. "It's okay, babe," he said softly, giving her a reassuring nod. "I'll just hand over my ID, and we'll be on our way." He didn't quite believe his own words, but he hoped they'd be true. Hannington was a man of caution, trained to assess risks, and he sensed something unsettling about this stop. But he wanted to keep Alia calm, so he kept his voice level and his expression steady. Two officers stepped out of the police car and approached, their strides slow and heavy. Hannington noticed the tall officer's tight jaw and cold eyes as he neared Hannington's window, peering inside with a look that felt more scrutinizing than necessary. The second officer, shorter and stockier, stood near the back of the car, his hand resting casually on his belt, fingers tapping near his weapon. Hannington rolled down the window, greeting the officers with a polite nod. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" The tall officer didn't return his greeting. Instead, he held out his hand and barked, "License and registration." His voice was clipped, his tone devoid of any warmth or respect. Hannington reached into his wallet and pulled out his license, along with his military ID, hoping that the latter would remind them of the dedication he had to serving the country. Maybe it would make them see him as more than just another driver on the road. He handed over the IDs and explained calmly, "I'm Staff Sergeant Hannington Williams, U.S. Army. My fiancée and I are on a road trip. We've done nothing wrong, officers." The tall officer's lips curled into a slight sneer as he glanced down at Hannington's military ID. He flicked it back and forth between his fingers, examining it with a look of amusement that sent a chill down Hannington's spine. The officer let out a low chuckle, then dropped the ID as if it were worthless, letting it fall to the ground. "So what? You think being in the military makes you special?" The officer sneered, crossing his arms. His eyes narrowed as he took in Hannington's composed demeanor. "Special forces, huh? Must feel real nice thinking you're above the rest of us." Hannington felt a surge of frustration, but kept his composure. He bent down, picking up his ID from the ground, brushing off the dirt with a sense of quiet dignity. "No, sir," he replied, looking the officer in the eye. "I'm just here to cooperate. We're not here to cause any trouble." "Cause trouble?" The officer scoffed, exchanging a mocking glance with his partner. "Oh, I think you might be up to something. What's with all the driving around? Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Hannington resisted the urge to sigh. "We're just on a road trip, enjoying some time together." The second officer chimed in, leaning closer to the window on Alia's side. "Enjoying time together, huh?" He looked Alia up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her visibly uncomfortable. "You got anything in the car we should know about?" Alia, sensing the officer's hostility, shifted nervously in her seat, crossing her arms over her chest. "Officers, we're just minding our own business," she said quietly, her voice quivering. The second officer let out a chuckle, folding his arms. "Minding your business? Then why do I feel like you're hiding something?" He nodded at Alia's phone, which she had instinctively reached for. "And you think you're going to start recording us? You put that phone down, or there'll be consequences." Hannington's heart raced, the anger bubbling just beneath his calm exterior. Alia's expression had changed from worry to outright fear, her hand freezing midair. She slowly lowered her phone, casting an anxious glance at Hannington, who nodded slightly to reassure her. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the ugliness of this moment, but he also knew he needed to keep a lid on his own anger. Reacting would only make things worse. "Look, we're not here to start any trouble," Hannington repeated, hoping to appeal to some ounce of decency within them. "We're just on a road trip." The tall officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a mocking tone. "What kind of hero are you supposed to be anyway?" Hannington felt a flash of indignation, but he forced himself to remain silent, his jaw clenching. He was used to handling pressure, to staying calm under extreme circumstances. But this was different. This was an attack on his dignity, his worth, and everything he stood for. Yet he knew that showing anger now could put Alia at risk, so he swallowed the insult and held his ground. The second officer looked at Hannington with a condescending grin. "You think you're something special, don't you? Some kind of war hero who thinks he's above the law." He chuckled, exchanging a knowing look with his partner. "No, sir. I'm just a man who respects the law," Hannington said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm cooperating with you, but I don't see why this is necessary." The tall officer's eyes narrowed. He took a step back, crossing his arms as he looked Hannington over, sizing him up with a gaze that seemed intent on finding fault, no matter what Hannington said or did. "Step out of the car," he ordered coldly. Hannington hesitated for a split second, his instincts screaming that this was not going to end well. But he complied, carefully opening the door and stepping out, his posture controlled and respectful. He glanced back at Alia, who watched him with fear in her eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth, as if to hold back a scream. The tall officer circled him slowly, a smirk playing at his lips. "You think that uniform makes you untouchable? Like we're supposed to look at you and think you're someone worth respecting?" Hannington's silence was his answer. He knew nothing he said would make a difference now, so he kept his gaze forward, his expression calm. The second officer moved in closer, looking Hannington over with a mixture of disdain and amusement. "And what's with her?" he asked, jerking his chin toward Alia. "She thinks she's going to record us, huh? Like that's going to stop anything. She better learn her place too." Hannington felt a pang of anger at the insult, but he maintained his steady composure. "My fiancée is only scared because of how you're treating us," he said carefully, choosing his words with caution. "Oh, so now you're the one setting the rules?" The tall officer sneered, a mocking edge to his voice. "Well, why don't we show you how things work around here?" Before Hannington could respond, the officer grabbed his shoulder and spun him around, pushing him roughly against the side of the car. The officer's grip was strong, but Hannington kept his breathing even, forcing himself to remain calm as the officer pressed him against the cold metal. "Hands behind your back," the officer ordered, snapping handcuffs onto Hannington's wrists with unnecessary force. Hannington winced, but he made no sound. Behind him, he could hear Aaliyah's soft gasp, her fear palpable. She started to move, her hand reaching for the door handle, but the second officer shook his head, his face a twisted mask of contempt. "Stay where you are, miss," he warned, his voice hard. "Unless you want to join him out here." Aaliyah froze, her hand dropping to her side as she watched helplessly. Hannington felt his stomach churn at the sight of her, so scared and vulnerable. But he held back the surge of protectiveness, knowing that defiance would only make things worse. He had to stay calm, for her sake, for both of them. The tall officer leaned close to his ear, his voice barely a whisper but filled with malice. "You're not special. You're just another nobody who thinks he deserves respect," he hissed. "But not here. Not today." The taller officer, still smirking, crossed his arms and stepped closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Let's see how tough you really are, soldier," he sneered. "Get down on your knees." Hannington hesitated, feeling the gravel underfoot, sharp and unyielding. His instinct was to stand his ground, to show that he wouldn't be degraded this way. But the officer's hand moved to his baton, tapping it against his palm with a cruel smile, daring Hannington to resist. Swallowing his pride, Hannington slowly lowered himself onto his knees. The gravel bit into him instantly, sharp stones pressing into his skin. He fought to keep his face blank, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort. Behind him, Aaliyah gasped, a hand pressed to her mouth as she watched. She reached for her door handle, ready to get out, but the second officer moved to her side of the car, leaning in with a threatening glare. "You stay right there, miss," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "One more move and you'll be out here too." Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling as she withdrew it, helplessness written all over her face. She looked at Hannington, and he could see her pain, her silent plea for this to end. But there was nothing he could do to shield her from the ugliness of the moment. The tall officer circled him, grinning with satisfaction. "Oh, so you're willing to get on your knees for us, are you?" he sneered. "Well, maybe you should go a bit further. Let's see you crawl." Hannington's body stiffened, his muscles tensing as the officer's words sank in. He looked down at the gravel-strewn ground, each stone a sharp reminder of the humiliation he was being forced to endure. Crawling was something he'd only seen as a soldier during training or in combat, but here, on this road, it felt demeaning in a way he'd never experienced. The officers knew this and were reveling in their power, pushing him to the edge. The officer raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at his lips as he glanced toward the police car parked a few feet ahead. "Go on, hero. Crawl to the car. Or are you too good for that?" Hannington's heart pounded, every fiber of his being screaming against the demand. But he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm, because reacting would only escalate things. He thought of Aaliyah, of the horror in her eyes, and knew he had to endure this for her sake. He couldn't risk making things worse. Slowly, he lowered himself onto his hands, feeling the rough gravel scrape against his palms. The sting of the rocks cut into his skin as he began to crawl, inch by agonizing inch, toward the squad car. His knees throbbed, each movement driving the gravel deeper into his flesh. But he gritted his teeth, focusing on maintaining his composure. Behind him, he could hear the officers laughing, their voices filled with cruel amusement. "Look at him, crawling like he thinks he's in training camp," the second officer jeered. "You'd think he'd be used to this by now." Hannington kept moving, his face impassive despite the pain radiating from his knees and hands. The laughter echoed in his ears, each taunt feeling like a slap, but he blocked it out, keeping his gaze focused ahead. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing his pain, of seeing him break. As he crawled, his body ached, his dignity stripped away with each movement. The gravel seemed to stretch endlessly before him, every inch an eternity. He could feel each jab and scrape, but he refused to show his pain. He knew Aaliyah was watching, and he couldn't bear the thought of her seeing him crumble. He would endure this for her, for both of them. Aaliyah's voice broke through the officer's laughter, her tone trembling but defiant. "Please, this isn't right. He hasn't done anything wrong." Her voice was small, but filled with desperation. The tall officer turned to her, his expression hardening as he sneered. "Didn't I tell you to keep quiet?" He snapped. "You don't get a say in this. Now sit there and watch, or you'll be joining him." Aaliyah fell silent, her lips quivering as she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Hannington saw the pain in her face, her helplessness, and it cut him deeper than any wound he'd ever endured. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from this nightmare, but he was powerless. He kept crawling, forcing himself to move forward, every inch feeling like an eternity. Finally, he reached the squad car, stopping just short of it and lifting himself onto his knees, struggling to catch his breath. His body throbbed, his hands and knees raw from the gravel, but he remained steady, keeping his head high. The officers walked over, smirking down at him, clearly pleased with their handiwork. The tall officer leaned close, his voice dripping with disdain. "What's the matter, soldier? I thought you were supposed to be tough. Guess you're not so special after all, huh?" Hannington met his gaze, his expression unyielding. He wouldn't let them break him. Not here. Not now. But inside, he felt the weight of the humiliation pressing down on him, the sting of degradation that would linger long after the pain faded. The second officer chuckled, looking Hannington up and down with a mocking grin. "Bet you thought that uniform made you someone. Turns out, you're just like everybody else, maybe even less." Hannington clenched his fists behind his back, the metal of the cuffs digging into his wrists. His heart ached, not for himself, but for Aaliyah, who was forced to witness this, powerless to help him. He could feel her pain, her silent outrage, but he forced himself to remain calm, to hold on for her sake. The officers exchanged one last glance, satisfied with their display of power. The tall officer smirked as he turned away, his voice loud enough for Aaliyah to hear. "Remember this, hero. You're no better than anyone else. Don't forget it." With that, they walked away, their laughter fading as they returned to their car, leaving Hannington kneeling on the gravel, battered and bruised in body and spirit. He could hear Aaliyah's soft sobs behind him, and his heart twisted with the pain of her suffering, of the helplessness he felt in not being able to shield her from this ordeal. Aaliyah rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she reached for him, touching his scraped hands gently. "Hannington, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "You didn't deserve this." Hannington forced a small, reassuring smile, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek. "I'm okay," he murmured, though his voice was strained. "As long as you're safe, that's all that matters." Hannington knelt on the rough gravel beside the squad car, his body aching from the pain of crawling, his spirit weighed down by the humiliation he had endured. He was barely able to steady his breath when he heard the faint sound of another engine approaching. Aaliyah looked up, her face still wet with tears, as an unmarked black car pulled onto the shoulder, parking a few yards from the scene. The car was sleek and official-looking, with tinted windows that gave no hint of who might be inside. The two officers glanced over, their relaxed, smug expressions replaced with wary surprise. As the car door opened, a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. He looked out of place in his pressed suit and polished shoes, an imposing figure against the rugged landscape of the highway shoulder. His piercing gaze swept over Hannington, the officers, and then Aaliyah. Without a word, he strode over, his expression darkening as he took in the sight of Hannington, bruised and humiliated on his knees, and Alia standing nearby with red-rimmed eyes. The officers straightened up, visibly uncomfortable as the man approached, each of them casting nervous glances at each other. The taller officer cleared his throat, trying to maintain an air of authority. "Can we help you, sir?" he asked, though his tone lacked the usual confidence. The man didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a badge, flashing it with a precision that made it clear he was no regular passerby. The badge glinted in the sunlight, the bold letters unmistakable FBI. The officers' faces paled as they registered what this meant, their bravado vanishing in an instant. "I'm Special Agent Robert Hale," the man said, his voice low and controlled, though there was an edge to it that sent a chill through the air. He didn't look at the officers. His attention was focused solely on Hannington, who was still on his knees. Agent Hale's gaze softened slightly as he took in Hannington's cuffs, the bruises on his wrists, the dirt and scrapes on his skin. "Are you Hannington Williams?" he asked, his tone respectful. Hannington looked up, his surprise evident, but he managed a nod. "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Hannington Williams." Agent Hale's expression hardened again as he turned to the officers, his piercing gaze making them visibly squirm. "I've been following your department's activities for some time now," he said coldly. "I've been undercover, gathering evidence on a series of complaints about racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power." The officers looked at each other, a mixture of shock and panic on their faces. The taller one opened his mouth, attempting to defend himself, but Agent Hale raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear any excuses," he said sharply. "What I've just witnessed is more than enough to warrant action. I've seen enough from your department, but this is blatant abuse." The shorter officer stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we were just following procedure. This man was acting suspiciously, and we..." "Suspiciously?" Agent Hale's voice was laced with incredulity as he glared at them. "You forced a decorated soldier to crawl on the gravel. You treated him with outright disrespect, even after he showed you his military ID. Your actions were not just unprofessional, they were inhuman." He took a step closer to them, his voice dropping lower, each word a quiet threat. "I've been documenting cases like this for months now, building a case against officers like you who think you're untouchable. But today, you've taken things too far." The officers were silent, their faces pale as they absorbed his words. Agent Hale turned to Hannington, his expression softening again as he reached down and helped him to his feet. Hannington winced slightly as he stood, but he managed to meet Agent Hale's gaze with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you, sir," Hannington said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. It felt surreal to have someone in power finally stand up for him after everything he had endured. Agent Hale placed a hand on Hannington's shoulder, a gesture of respect. "Sergeant Williams, I apologize for what you've been through. You should never have been treated like this." Alia, still standing by the car, let out a small sob of relief, covering her mouth as she watched Hannington being helped up. She took a shaky step forward, reaching for Hannington's hand as he turned to her, pulling her close in a quiet embrace. They stood together, their shared pain and relief evident as they clung to each other, the worst of their ordeal finally coming to an end. Agent Hale turned back to the officers, who now looked small and defeated, their previous arrogance shattered. He addressed them with icy authority, his voice filled with contempt. "You're both being placed under immediate suspension, effective right now," he said, his tone final. "I'll be reporting this incident directly to your superiors, and believe me, there will be consequences." The officers' faces drained of color as they realized the gravity of the situation. The taller officer stammered, his voice barely audible. "Suspension, but we were just..." "You were just what?" Agent Hale interrupted, his tone deadly calm. "Just abusing your authority. Just humiliating an innocent man and traumatizing his fiancée. You've crossed every line, and you're going to face the full weight of the law for it." The officers were silent, their shoulders slumping as they looked at the ground, their confidence shattered. Agent Hale pulled out his phone, dialing a number and speaking quietly but firmly, relaying the events he had witnessed. When he hung up, he looked at the officers one last time, his eyes filled with disgust. "You two have no idea the harm you've done. But trust me, you will." The taller officer attempted a weak protest. "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding. We were simply following standard protocol." Agent Hale's sharp gaze cut him off mid-sentence. "Standard protocol," he repeated, his voice laced with disdain. "What part of protocol includes humiliating a decorated soldier and forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees in front of his fiancée?" The shorter officer swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't what it looked like. Agent Hale raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't need your excuses. What I witnessed was gross misconduct and an abuse of authority that goes beyond any acceptable standard." He pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open and scribbling something before looking back at them, his expression deadly serious. "Both of you are suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. I'll be reporting this directly to Internal Affairs." The officers' faces drained of color, the reality of their actions setting in. The tall officer stammered, his voice wavering. "Suspension. But we were just doing our jobs." "Your job," Agent Hale replied icily, "is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and degrade. This goes beyond a minor infraction. Your careers, your reputations, everything you've taken for granted may well be over after today." Hannington stood silently to the side, his arm around Aaliyah as they watched the exchange. A mix of relief and disbelief washed over him as he took in the scene. After all he had endured, the tables had turned, and justice was finally being served. The officers, who had once looked down at him with such arrogance, now stood with their heads bowed, their confidence shattered. Agent Hale turned to Hannington and Aaliyah, his expression softening. "Sergeant Williams," he said respectfully, "I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced today. No one should be treated the way you were, especially not someone who has dedicated his life to protecting this country." Hannington nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Agent Hale. I appreciate you stepping in." Agent Hale shook his head. "It's not about stepping in. It's about doing what's right. You showed more dignity and restraint than most people would have. I commend you for that." He then glanced at Aaliyah, his eyes gentle as he addressed her. "Miss, I'm sorry you had to witness this. You shouldn't have had to experience such fear and helplessness. I assure you, this will not go unnoticed." Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a grateful smile. "Thank you. It means so much to know someone cares." Agent Hale's expression softened even further, but his tone was resolute. "We're going to ensure justice is served. Officers like these two give a bad name to the many who do their jobs honorably. I can promise you, they will be held accountable." He turned back to the officers, who now seemed smaller, their shoulders slumped, their eyes downcast as they faced the crushing reality of their actions. Gone was the arrogance, the sneers, the confidence that had filled their voices earlier. In its place was fear of consequences they had never imagined facing. Agent Hale gestured toward their police car, his voice cold and unyielding. "You're dismissed from this scene. Gather your belongings, return to the station, and prepare for an inquiry. I'll be there shortly to follow up with Internal Affairs." The officers didn't dare argue. They nodded, their faces grim as they turned and walked to their squad car. Hannington and Aaliyah watched as they fumbled, visibly shaken, the weight of their punishment hanging heavily over them. The once powerful officers, who had held Hannington and Aaliyah in such disdain, now moved like defeated men, their careers and reputations hanging by a thread. As the officers climbed into their car and drove off, Aaliyah let out a deep, shaky breath, her hand still trembling as she reached for Hannington's. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with relief and disbelief. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hannington nodded, his hand warm, and steady in hers. "Yes," he said softly, "it's finally over." Agent Hale walked over to them once more, his expression respectful and kind. "I know today was painful," he said, his voice calm. "But you both stood strong in the face of something that was beyond wrong. I'll be filing a full report, and you'll be kept informed every step of the way. And if you need any further assistance, don't hesitate to reach out." Hannington shook his hand, feeling a newfound respect for the man who had restored his faith in justice. "Thank you, Agent Hale. It's hard to find the words, but thank you." Agent Hale gave him a firm nod. "You're welcome, Sergeant, and thank you for your service, both here and abroad. You've shown a strength that not many could." As Agent Hale returned to his car, Hannington and Alia exchanged a long, silent look. The weight of the day's events settled heavily between them, a mixture of relief, pain, and a lingering sense of disbelief. But beneath it all, there was a quiet strength, a resilience that had carried them through the darkest moments. Hand in hand, they walked back to their car, feeling a renewed sense of hope. They had endured something unimaginable, something painful and unjust, but they had come through it together, and that bond, forged in the face of adversity, felt stronger than ever. As Hannington opened the car door for Alia, she paused, looking up at him with a soft, grateful smile. "You never once let them break you," she said, pride shining in her eyes. "You held your head high, no matter what they did." Hannington nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "I had to," he replied quietly. "For you, and for us." They sat in the car for a moment, soaking in the stillness that had replaced the chaos of the past few hours. The road stretched out before them, open and free, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Hannington felt a sense of peace settle over him. As they drove away, leaving the pain and humiliation behind, Hannington couldn't help but reflect on what they had endured. He had faced countless battles, seen dangers most people couldn't imagine. But this was a different kind of fight, a fight for dignity, for respect, for the basic human right to be treated with decency. In the silence of the car, he looked over at Alia, who was gazing out the window, a soft smile on her lips. They had been tested in ways they never could have prepared for, but they had come out stronger, with a renewed appreciation for each other, and for the strength that lay within them. As the miles rolled by, Hannington felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Justice had been served, and he had shown that strength wasn't always about physical power. Sometimes it was about standing tall, even in the face of cruelty, and holding on to one's dignity no matter the cost. They had endured, and they had triumphed, not with violence or anger, but with quiet resilience and unwavering faith in each other. And as they left the scene behind, they knew they were moving forward with a strength that nothing could take from them. For Hannington, that was the true victory. The knowledge that he had faced injustice and had not let it defeat him. He had proven that no matter how much others tried to tear him down, his strength came from within, from the love he shared with Alia, and from the unbreakable resolve that had carried him through even the darkest moments. And with that, they drove on together, toward a brighter, freer future. If you love this story, please subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching.